Earl, welcome into the podcast. It's great to have you here today with us.
Oh, thank you. The pleasure's all mine.
Well, I've been a fan for a long time, and I have been listening to your podcast, which we'll talk about, Inappropriate Earl. But I heard you on some other podcasts, some like Blockbuster Mentality, some friends of mine, and a couple other shows. And so I was like, I need to have him on because I find you as a comedian and a writer extremely fascinating because of your involvement in the industry. You've kind of done a lot of different things. You are part of the Comedy Store. You were on I'm Dying Up Here, which was a fantastic show. I guess let's just start with that. That was a great show, and sad that it didn't get picked up, or I don't know what happened with shows like that. They just kind of come and then they do well, and then we don't get much more of it. But let's talk about that and sort of your involvement with that show and how that started for you, and for people who might not know what the show was about.
How it started was the producer, one of the producers. There were so many people working on that show. It's kind of, there wasn't just one of anything. There's like 8 camera guys, 4 boom guys, 6 casting directors. One of the producers saw me at Roast Battle,
Okay.
which is the weekly show still going on at the Comedy Store in the Belly Room. And that was before I started battling. I played, I guess you'd call it like an Archie Bunker type character. I was like the heckler of Roast Battle. So when a battle wouldn't go well, which was quite often, believe me, I would say a line to get the room back. And the producer, I guess, said to one of my friends, "Who's that crazy guy in the corner? He's great." And I didn't even have to audition for I'm Dying Up Here. He just called me in and was like, "We have this role for you. It's a bitter late night comic. All he does is the same set. He talks about his ex-wife leaving him." And I know so many comics like that. I'm like, oh yeah, I won't even have to act.
You're like that's like 5 of my closest friends.
Well, there's so many comics, especially late night comics. And if you're a comedy fan or comedy club fan, the late night bitter comic is one of the more essential parts of any comedy club. There's just that guy, or it could be a girl, but usually it's a guy who has just been around forever. All his friends are getting more successful than he is, and he's just angry and bitter, and he just does the same set, doesn't write new jokes. So I'm like, yeah, that won't be a problem for me. And that's how I got the part. And I think I was in about 11 of the 20 episodes. And it was sad when it didn't get brought back, but not unexpected, because the ratings were never good.
Really?
I think most people on the show were very surprised it was brought back a second season. So, and it's still, I look back and, and I've said this before in other interviews, most of the complaints about the show from my friends were 2 things. One, it's on Showtime and it's hard to find. And it's like, everyone can get Showtime. Like it's not like it's Channel J in New York where, you have to look for it. It's Showtime. And 2, it wasn't funny. And I was like, well, it's not a sitcom. Stand-up is a very sad business. Just this year alone, I've lost 3 comics who died. So, it just never, for whatever reason, it never grabbed the ratings, and I'll never understand why. Because Melissa Leo, she won an Oscar, so she's legit. And then all the actors who were playing comics are all top working actors, like Clark Duke and Jake Lacey and Michael Aragano, and then all the comics who were, I guess, actors on the show, like Santino and Eric Griffin, Al Madrigal. They're all great comics, and the guest stars were like Alfred Molina, and, Rick Overton, who, if you are a comedy fan, he's a legend in the business. Like, he played the Booker of the Tonight Show. But he's like a god to me. So it was just like, how is this show not doing better?
Yeah, I watched the whole thing like in real time. Essentially, from what I understand, it's loosely based on, well, Jim Carrey was kind of like one of the people behind it, but it's kind of based on like the late 70s, 80s comedy boom in LA, or kind of like on the Comedy Store, right? Essentially, and kind of the comics, how comics would get passed and what that procedure was, or what that path was to be in a club and then to get passed and then to get on the Tonight Show or one of these networks and then eventually, get a television show.
Yeah, it was based on the Comedy Store, which I think might have also confused people because, like, you had Richard Pryor at the end of, I think, season 2. He was just Richard Pryor, but then I think people would look at, say, Santino and go, well, is he playing Bill Hicks, or is he David Letterman, or is it just a combo? A lot of people, and I was barely in the show, but in it enough to say I was in it. People would ask me, "Are you Richard Lewis? Like you're kind of bitter, and are you Robert Schimmel? Because in the few stand-up clips that you saw of me, I was very Robert Schimmel-esque, just kind of bitter and whatnot. Was Al Madrigal playing Freddie Prinze, or was he just a kind of a hodgepodge of different Hispanic comics? So I think that was also a part of the problem. But I'll guess, and nobody's told me this, but I'll guess that certain people didn't want to be portrayed. So you couldn't, you couldn't say this is Comic X because Comic X didn't want to be on the show. I mean, I think everyone in the comedy world knew that this was going to be a dark portrayal of certain people. Like even Dylan Baker, who's like a legendary, I guess you'd call him a character actor, who played Johnny Carson. It wasn't the most flattering portrayal of Johnny Carson. Like, it was kind of, oh, he's a dick. But that's how Carson was. If you hear like stories about him, he could be really prickly to you. And they also, I've had friends of mine who did David Letterman, and they kind of said he was very similar. So I'll just never understand how the TV business works. I mean, I will give Showtime this. They did seem to try a little bit of everything to get the show going. Like that, I think the first season we were on after after Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And then I think season 2, we were after Ray Donovan, which is, so it seemed like they tried to get us going, but.
Well, it was a great show.
I'm puzzled still.
Yeah, it's very interesting how television works, like, especially now with all the content that's available. And like, it seems almost anybody can get a show up on a network somewhere, and then we get excited about it, and then it doesn't last for very long. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. It was great for me as somebody who is a fan of comedy and enjoys understanding comedy history and really all that goes into it. That's why I love talking to comedians and writers, because I find the work that you do extremely fascinating, because it's not something that I'm familiar with other than just either talking to folks like yourself or watching it from an outside perspective. I want to talk about this because I have to be honest, a lot of people that I talk to don't always email things that they're okay talking about or they want to talk about, but you emailed me. So I'm very curious, and not necessarily about the negative aspects of it, but I do want to talk about the roast battle, because that's one of the things out of all of it that I find to be the most curious is the roast battle, and how that whole thing works. I would agree with you. I kind of feel that you were unfairly judged, or whatever you want to describe it. Let's talk about that and kind of how that works for you as a comic. And definitely all the positives, my friend, because I'm just, it's coming from a position of curiosity.
That's going to be hard to be positive, but
I mean, it's up to you.
think,
Yeah.
well, I think people like when I talk about it because I'm honest. You know, very
Yeah.
rarely will someone do a television show that was pretty successful. And like I said, the weekly show is still going on. I don't know who the hell roast battles in 2021, but that ain't my problem. But it was fascinating to see how a television network buys a show and, in my opinion, ruins it. It was educational. Like I said on I'm Dying Up Here, I wasn't really in it enough to give an opinion on, hey, you guys should do this. But with Roast Battle, I was there from literally day one. So it was fascinating to see two open mic comics, or let me rephrase that, two newer comics, because I hate saying open mic comic because it's very dismissive. But two newer comics, and they were about to get into a fight. And Brian Moses said, now keep in mind, this is 7, maybe 8 years ago. So
Sure.
it's not an exact quote. He was like, hey, you guys can't fight. Why don't you slap each other? Which in the hood is what they call, basically roasting in the hood is called slapping, so it's basically roast each other. And it was so fun to watch. And there was only like 5 people in the room because Moses had taken over an open mic that was horrible. And because this is right before the Comedy Store started popping again. So it was pretty empty on a Tuesday night specifically. So the next week, Moses starts the open mic and no one wanted to do stand-up. They wanted to roast each other. They're like, hey, can we do that? And then the next week, same thing. And there's maybe 10 people in the room now. And then I think the 4th week, he couldn't find anyone to roast. So he said to me, hey, do you want to roast Boone Shakalaka? Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Comedy Store, Boone Shakalaka is a homeless man who just hangs out there. And he's kind of funny. He steals things and sells them to the comics for $1.
Yeah, I've heard about this guy.
He's legendary. And I can't do him enough justice. You just have to meet him to go. If you ever go to the Comedy Store and he's there, you will go, that's Boone Shakalaka. You won't even need an introduction. You'll be like, that's the guy Earl was talking about. So I roasted him, or we roast back. And he's not as easy to beat as you would think. Like, you can't roast crazy. This is a guy who has a hard life, and he's done things on a nightly basis that hopefully most humans don't have to do to get a meal or a place to stay. So roasting to him is nothing. And then, the next week it was the same thing. And then little by little, the Belly Room on Tuesday nights became the epicenter of LA comedy. And for about 1.5 to 2 years, it was just the little show that could. People were lining up to battle. I mean, we would have as many as 10 battles in one night. So 20 comics. And I was the heckler, sidekick to Moses. And then Jeff Ross got involved, and he made it a bigger show for sure. I mean, he got it on TV, but I think once the network, and it's crazy to say this because he got it to TV and Comedy Central got it to the Montreal Comedy Festival, and but it just it's kind of like when a band, their first album is usually their best album, and then the bigger they get, the lazier they get, and it's just not the same. It was kind of like that. It was just someone, either Jeff or the network, or probably both, had it in their heads, we need celebrities to do this. And it's like, no, you don't. You need 2 people who are good at it, and that sells the show. It's kind of like, that's why Yo Mama lasted for, I think, 9 or 10 seasons, because they didn't have any celebrities. They just had 2 usually younger kids who were good at the craft of Yo Mama, and then the same with Roast Battle, which is much more evolved than Yo Mama, because you have to research your opponent and come up with 3 or 4 crafted jokes on them specifically. Whereas Yo Mama, you could kind of cheat and just do it generic. Well, Yo Mama. So celebrities just aren't good at it. They're not going to take the time to research. Like Ralphie May, who was a dear friend. I love Ralphie. He was an amazing, amazing man. He did not research Mike Lawrence, and that was very clear. Like Mike.
Yeah, that was kind of uncomfortable
Mike,
to a point for me as a viewer.
Oh, I'm telling you right now, I've done comedy for so long. I don't remember how long I've done it. Like I'll say 22 years. And I remember because that was the second night of battles. I had already battled, so I got to watch, which was great. To just go there in a packed room and watch. I've never felt more uncomfortable in my life. Like after the first joke of Ralphie's was a street joke, I think he said something to the effect of, "Mike, your breath is so bad it makes onions cry." Like that's a joke I've heard in 3rd grade. Like literally the same joke. And that's part of like the unwritten rules of roast battle is no street jokes, no Yo Mama jokes, unless you actually have a joke about the person's mom, which some people did. So I'm sure in someone's head it was like, well, Ralphie May's a big comic. He's got all these specials on TV. He's on the Jay Moore show. Like people tune in to watch him, and like it didn't work out that way, And it just like the last. I was on season 1, but like season 3, you had Blake Griffin, like he's a funny guy. Like there's no doubt he's funny for someone who's never done the skill set of comedy or roasting. But like, most people will tell you he beat Jeff Ross, but they gave it some hogwash tie. And it's like, the show's done. Like you literally just had an NBA player who's never done it before. Most people will tell you off the record, beat the guy whose name is on the show. So it's like, how can he judge another battle when he just lost to a guy who's never done it before? So, once you started getting like celebrities involved, like I love Todd Barry, like he's a comedy legend. Probably one of the highlights of my life, my comedy life is, and probably my life is getting to do his crowd work show at Cluster Fest, which is a huge comedy festival. So I love him, but he's not a roast battle comic. But, I'm sure Comedy Central was like, well, let's get Comedy Central comics who have specials coming out or who are working with us. And it's like, no, that's going to ruin the show. Like just have the LA comics and a few in New York who are maybe unknowns, have them on it because they're good. And you won't need the extra selling point of, well, this guy may suck, but he's a celebrity. So it was just fascinating to see a show go, through many hands and it was, kind of, I have my own personal, some may call it vendetta against certain people, but, I wasn't treated well on the show. And that hurt probably to this day, because I didn't create the show. Brian Moses did, but I helped create what it became. Like, so it was kind of like, why am I being like, I was given the toughest battles, like in my season, I was given Tom Ballard and Jimmy Carr and Sarah Tiana and K. Trevor Wilson, while other people were getting people who'd never battled before. I'm like, well, why don't I get one of those battles just to, keep me on the show, or like, or I don't mind having all the toughest battles, but I want to make sure everyone else has them too. Like, so, it was just, as I tell people jokingly, but not, it's a cold business. And I think, so I left with a bitter taste in my mouth in that regard to the show.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it is a very tough and bitter business. Like it's very competitive. And, the fact that you even said, I don't like to call them open mic comics because it is kind of dismissive, but it really is. Like when I hear it, it kind of already in my head makes me go, huh, is this somebody that I would want to pay to see? Of course I would, just because I love comedy, but I find the business that you're in very competitive. You've been doing it for over 20 plus years, probably more, I'm sure. And then like it seems like, you know, LA's the hot spot, New York's the hot spot. But when you got started, Earl, in this business, what was kind of your path to success as far as becoming known? And did you work the crazy rooms? Did you work all the wild places? Like what? I'm familiar with part of it, but I'm also just curious, like your journey compared to, say, somebody else's journey today. That, I mean, it's markedly different, but what your process was to get where you were.
Well, I mean, I'm from LA, so I'm far from a naive person. Like I grew up playing golf at my father's country club, and there's a point to this that has nothing to do with comedy, but it kind of does. And the people I were around at this country club were billionaires, card sharks. I think there was a pimp, pool hustlers. They had a room at Bel Air Country Club, and they might still have it, called the card room. And to grow up in that room and to see the gambling and the just shenanigans, it was very preparatory for my stand-up career. Like looking back at the predators that were in that room, in terms, I don't mean sexual, but like just anything to make a buck off your friend.
Sure.
So I went into comedy very almost at a good starting point of, there's going to be a lot of con artists and hustlers, just be aware. And my original game plan was just outwork everyone, and you'll make it. Of course, everyone is a different, what making it is to me might not be what it is to you, and so on. But I probably found that about 7 or 8 years in, and when I say I outworked everyone, like first 3 to 4 years in comedy, I would go up 7 nights a week, 3 times a night. So I was going on average 20 to 25 times a week. And even on a night where, like, say I would go to a Kiss concert in Irvine, which is in Orange County, for those of you not in LA, I would leave the concert early, go to Ontario, which is further into Orange County, do an open mic there, and then drive like a wild man to Van Nuys, which is the complete opposite end of LA,
Yeah.
to go to a bar show. Like, so no one outworked me, but I wish I would have worked a little smarter, maybe networked a little better, because that's what this business has become. You see it, without mentioning names, the comics you see most on TV aren't necessarily the funniest. That there are people who've networked their way into a good manager, good agent, have buddied up to the local bookers, comedy club owners, and like I was just like, well, I just want to be funnier than everyone, and I'm not, but like that's what I want to be, and it just, comedy doesn't work like that. So probably about, let me see, about 2009, I started opening for Rob Schneider, and traveled the world with him. I mean, and by world, I mean Canada and the US. And that kind of opened my eyes up to some of the good things in the business, sold out crowds every night. And I knew they weren't there to see me. But still, I got to be a part of it. I mean, even my girlfriend at the time would go to see Rob. And then about 2014, and this is where a little bit of luck comes in. About 2011, I did the Tempe Improv, and the manager was a guy by the name of Adam Egget, who podcast fans know as Norm Macdonald's sidekick. But he was managing the Tempe Improv, and just by fate, around 2013, he became, I think he was the manager of the Comedy Store. And then when a certain individual was fired at the Comedy Store for let's just say they're interesting accounting methods. Adam became the new booker, and I was the first person, along with Candace Thompson. He passed. So that's when my career, I won't say took off, but got a lot better, just because, every night at the Comedy Store, you're going up in front of somebody. They might be, Metallica's manager. So maybe you could open for them on the road, although I suspect that would be a tough gig, or some booker of a TV show. And then Roast Battle was really coming into its own. So I got passed, and Roast Battle started taking off at the same time. So, but that's 13 years in. So it was not, an open overnight success, but I would say 2016, I was on 4 different networks, 4 different shows. So I went from nothing, literally no TV credits, to 4 in a couple months.
It's safe to say hard work is what really pays off, and making that mental choice to be the hardest worker in the room, especially in a business that's as competitive as yours, comedy, television, everybody's vying for that spot to be known.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I would almost correct myself and say smart work pays off. And it's like the old Tony Robbins analogy of the fly trying to get out of the glass, just hitting the same spot over and over and over again. That was me the first 13 years. I was outworking everyone, but like there were times when, like, Whitney Cummings and I would do this outdoor open mic on Friday and Saturday nights in Studio City. And she would always ask me after our sets, hey, let's go somewhere and write. And I'd be like, I didn't tell her this, but I'm going to go look for some girls, man. You go home and write. I'm going to go get laid. But so looking back, I wish I would have gone to the coffee shop with her and written, because I probably would have been in her posse. I would, if any young comics are listening to this, just work smart, not necessarily harder.
I love it. Well, one last question here as we kind of wrap this up. I want to talk about your podcast. Well, there's your animated series, The Jellies, which is great. If you haven't seen that, people need to do that because you're a part of that show. If we could talk about that and your podcast, Inappropriate Earl, you've had some amazingly fascinating people on your podcast. And I've been a fast fan for a long time. And let's talk about how those 2 projects came about for you.
Well, I talk about, some of the bad things on Roast Battle, but, the Jellies is one of the good things. I think, people don't understand that first year and a half of Roast Battle was so insane that it had a very 8 Mile Fight Club type of energy to it. So you get some weird celebrities and this is before Jeff got involved, but one night, Gerard Carmichael brought in Tyler, the Creator, who I had never known before. I'm a metalhead, Metallica, Rat, Poison, all that stuff. So I'm doing my Archie Bunker character, and I just start picking on Tyler, the Creator, just thinking he's some young black kid in the crowd. And so I go in the parking lot after the show, and I had probably crossed the line that night with some things I said, to be honest. And I saw him talking to Gerard, and I'm like, oh, if he's friends with Carmichael, maybe I should apologize to him. So I walk up to their posse, and of course, it's all blacks. And so they all turn around and look at me like, what's this? They didn't say this, but they're like, I could see it in their eyes. They're like, what's this white guy want? And so I went up to Tyler, not knowing who he was, and said, hey, I'm Earl. I'm sorry if I offended you, man. I totally threw Brian Moses under the bus. I'm like, Brian tells me to say all that wacky stuff. And he's like, my man. Yeah, I mean, and he just looked at me and goes, do you want to be the dad on my cartoon? And I'm like, who are you? He's like, oh, I'm Tyler, the Creator. And not knowing he's like the biggest rapper in the world, I'm like, great, I'm Earl the comic. And then I became the lead on his cartoon, The Jellies. And it hasn't been canceled yet, but it's been 2 years, so it's not a good sign. But but Bob's Burgers came back after like a 2-year break, so it's not out of the realm. But I'm the only white guy on the show, and so it that showed me the bet. That was probably been my favorite gig I've ever gotten, because from day one till right now, Tyler and his crew, it's a very small crew. He just, him and his best friend Lionel write, and they keep a very, almost a skeleton crew of producers and writers. I've never been treated better in life by anyone. Like, you hear please, you hear thank you, even if you. Now my voice is so deep and unique, especially for a white person, that I'm not asked to do a lot of range. It's just like, because I remember the first day, I'd never done a voiceover gig before in my life. And the voiceover is 100 times harder a field than stand up. And I never thought I would say that, because there's not thousands of voiceover gigs, like there are in stand up. So you're competing
very competitive. Yeah.
Oh, it's beyond, like, just to give you an idea, like, and it's very categorized voiceovers. Like, you have your high pitched actors, you have your female, I guess you call it squeaky voice actors or actresses. I'm in the kind of a rare category, the deep baritone villains. And because I'm already on a cartoon on Adult Swim, which people work for 20 years, they don't get on an Adult Swim cartoon. So I'm going up against celebrities. Like, I go up, almost every gig I go up on, I'm going up against, say, Rob Riggle. I'm going up against Billy Brown, who people might not know the name Billy Brown, but if you've ever watched Sons of Anarchy, the last couple seasons, he was the main bad guy. He was just really good looking black dude, very chiseled. You got the Don Johnson, Miami Vice stubble. He's very distinct, but his voice is very deep. And so I'm going up against those guys. So I'm already at a starting point where I'm most likely not going to get the gig, because they want, it's very much the roast battle mindset of, we need a celebrity. We need Billy Brown to be the few, the proud, the Marines guy, which he is. We need Rob Riggle to be the bad guy voice in the new Batman movie. And if they are too busy, well, then maybe we'll go and look at Earl or hear Earl. But I love it, though. It's less BS in the world of voiceovers. It's doesn't boil down. And it boils down a lot less to who your manager is. And it's like, if they're looking for a particular voice, like Tyler, the Creator was, whatever I give him, he wanted. Like, and that part is luck, because, my mom was from Cartersville, Georgia, and she had this incredible Southern twang that most people thought she was black on the phone. And then my dad, it was it almost sounded like she was trying to do a parody of someone from the South, but it was really like, y'all better come back because Earl not home right now. That was her voice. And then my dad, just from Chicago, but had a booming, almost opera type voice. So genetic wise, I lucked out. But it's still like, in the voiceover world, I would say in 1 month, there's maybe 5 gigs for a deep voice, baritone bad guy, just 5. And all 5, I'm going to be going up against those guys I mentioned, and many more, I'm sure. Patrick Warburton and James Earl Jones, obviously the king of deep voice, Darth Vader. I'm sure he's still audition, or he probably doesn't even audition. They just give it to him. But when you're Darth Vader, I would want Darth Vader on the Jellies over my voice. But I love it, though. It's because I got a little bummed out, to be frank, before we start about the podcast. I'm pretty thick-skinned, and I've been rejected for thousands of gigs and literally stand-up and voiceovers. But how I'm treated in the voiceover world is really restored my faith and okay, I'm good enough to do this. And, and I still get rejected for probably 90% of the gigs I go for in voiceovers, but most people get rejected 100%. So it's like, just be happy for that 10% you get. And, it's been really fun, but I do owe that part of my career to Roast Battle, because if that wasn't a show, Tyler the Creator's not up there that night. It was very lucky. And so now on to the Inappropriate Earl podcast. But yeah, I mean, I love my podcast because I'm in control of it. I think I have 317 episodes, which
yes,
is
you have
a lot.
a lot. Yeah, that's a lot.
I mean, I think Rogan's at like something like 1,600, so it's not a lot in the grand scheme of, comparing myself to him, but it's more than most, because most people quit after, I'd say, 100 episodes, because they're like, all right, I'm not making any money on this. I'll just go back to whatever I was doing before. But I just love that out of all the guests I've had, I've only had one bad interview. And even in that case, I wanted them on my couch. This is before the pandemic, when I would do it in my home. So I've loved getting to meet some of my favorite singers. The singer from Rat has come on twice, which is completely mind blowing to me. Most people know him as the guy in the Geico commercial now, but like, Rat was a big part of my childhood. And I've had, famous comics on, Brody Stevens and I've started doing a dual podcast with my friend Chad Zumach. It's kind of like I guess you call it a swap cast, where he has a podcast called Sit Down Zumach. I do Inappropriate Earl, and we call it The Bad Guys. So we try and reach out to villains from the 80s movies that we like. I mean, it's hard because it's, if these guys are alive,
yeah.
Well, I kind of forget, the 80s were 40 years ago, like 1980, so if I before I started doing it with Chad, I remember I was watching TV one night and Superman 2 came on. And that's one of my favorite, that's before, they did CGI and all that stuff. And Gene Hackman was Lex Luthor. And I thought, I probably can't get Gene Hackman, but there was that trio of bad guys, Zod, who was the leader, and he's a very famous actor. So I thought he probably wouldn't come on. The girl probably wouldn't come on, but the big guy who doesn't talk, I wonder if he would come on. That would be a fun interview, to have the guy who's most famous, his most famous role, he didn't say one word. So I look his name up, and his name's Jack O'Halloran, and it turns out he was a very famous heavyweight boxer. And I reached out to him, and, not forgetting, he was probably 40 in 1980. This is, I think, around 2014, I reached out to him. So he's 70, 75. And I get a hold of him. He's on Twitter. I didn't even know if it was him. And he's like, can we do a Zoom? And I'm like, I don't do it that way. And he's like, can we do Skype? I'm like, I don't do it that way either. And he's like, how about a phone call? I'm like, no, you got to come to my house. And I'm sure for a 75-year-old actor, the last thing he wants to do is come to some dude's house. He probably thinks it's just an idiot fan. But I talked him into coming. He shows up at my door, and he's still a huge guy. Like, he's probably, probably still 6'5", and he's built like for a mid-70s. And it was probably one of the best interviews I've ever done. He was on my couch for like 3 hours. I couldn't get him to leave. Because I really didn't have a lot of knowledge of his boxing career, where he fought, I think, George Foreman. And so he was legit. And he got into all these conspiracy theories. And so, I just reach out to people. Most say, it's like the voiceover percentage. Most say no, and some say yes. And like next week, me and Chad are interviewing Brian E. Thompson, the bad guy from Cobra. So,
wow.
if you are older than say 35, the movie Cobra is pretty epic.
I love
and
it.
it's a great story. I don't want to turn this into the podcast about Cobra, but if most people don't realize that Cobra was the original screenplay to Beverly Hills Cop, and they gave it to Stallone. Stallone was going to be, I guess, Axel Foley, and he was like, "This is too funny. Like, I'm not a comic. Let's make it more violent." And there's a 3-hour and 20-minute cut of Cobra that it got an X rating, and I've reached out. You'd think I would ask my industry friends to get me on Conan, maybe the Tonight Show. I've got a lot of friends in the industry who probably would help me, and I've asked all of them not to get me on a TV show, not to talk to Netflix about a special, but I want to find that 3-hour and 20-minute cut of Cobra. And the bad guy in it, if you see the finished cut of Cobra, it's a very strange movie because you can clearly tell that they cut a lot of his parts out because Cobra, the theater version that we all saw is, I think, like 86 minutes. He's in it for maybe 10 minutes. And it's like, this doesn't make sense. And apparently Stallone in the recut was like, we're going to make this my story. We'll put the bad guy in the minimum amount. So I'm hoping that he has some good stories. And, I always try and find guests. I don't know about you, but like, to me, the best guests are ones who say talk a lot like me, but they're also slightly bitter and they want to talk about it. They want to talk about it. Like, I guess you'd say like me and Roast Battle, it's a great interview because I get into details.
I love it.
I hope, yeah, I mean, it's like I said, every podcast host is different. Like some like to be the star of the podcast. And like, to me, at least in the early days and well into Inappropriate Earl, I figure who's ever listening already knows my story. So I don't need to talk a lot. So I try and make the guest, like, you talk. I'll ask you. I always try and set up guests like you did with me with Roast Battle. I'll try and set up a guest with a one sentence question, knowing that that'll set them up for hopefully a 15-minute answer. So, so I'm looking forward to that interview next week. And then, I'll still have comics on. And, of course, now with the pandemic, it's harder to get people to want to do a Zoom interview, let alone come to your house and do it. So, but I just like doing in person better for me in my interviewing style. I like to, as silly as this sounds, I like to look in someone's eyes when they're in the same room.
No, I get it. It makes perfect sense because there's a different connection, and, when things started to pick up for me was during the pandemic, but Zoom has worked out well. But again, I look forward to doing more in-person interviews, getting out to Southern California soon. You have amazing work, my friend, and I appreciate your honesty with everything. And we'll put links to the show notes with your podcast, and we'll also link the Jellies and all the other projects. And if you haven't seen I'm Dying Up Here, go to Showtime. It's literally one of the easiest channels to find. Earl, I appreciate your time and hanging out with me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure.
I know, it's like you're making me laugh. It's like when people would tell me they couldn't find Showtime, it's like, bro, it's on every basic cable package on planet Earth. It's only like $5. I don't work for Showtime. I mean, I guess technically I do, but like, it's not that hard. But I will say, with the Jellies, which is my most current thing, because I get this a lot too. Well, I don't get Adult Swim. I'm like, well, it's on the Cartoon Network. I don't get the Cartoon Network. It's like, everybody gets those channels. It's also on HBO Max now. So don't tell me you can't find HBO on your local cable provider's system. But thank you, dude. I really, when I got your message for a request, I'm like, God, this sounds like a scam for like podcast follows. And I'm like, oh no, this is an actual real person. So thank you. I love doing this. So, and I hope that if younger comics listen, that I'm not bitter younger comics. I'm just honest. There's a big difference.